Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hart and Hustle podcast. Now, I've got a really special episode for you today. I've got an amazing president and CEO named Mark Dhooge. Now, Mark is leading an organization called Kids in Distress and Family Central. This organization has been serving over 20,000 at-risk youth in Southern Florida. In today's conversation, you're going to hear me and Mark talk about the challenges of being a leader in a nonprofit space, what it's like to innovate with resources in the community to meet individuals where they need to be met, the impact that we're having on a younger generation, but also the mindset that it takes to be able to overcome challenges in our lives and why that's so important. Let's get into the episode.
If you know that, hey, I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to fall down, but I was able to get up before and I'm going to do it again. And that's when you become unstoppable. And that's when meaningful change and really being able to succeed is, in my view, inevitable.
All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hart and Hustle podcast. I'm incredibly excited because I have Mark Dhooge with me here today. Now, Mark is an individual who is the president and CEO of Kids in Distress and Family Central, Inc. Now, what makes Mark incredibly special is your dedication to the space. You spent over 30 years now in this organization and serving this larger mission for your community. Mark, thank you so much for being here with me, man. I really appreciate it.
Keenan, it is such a pleasure. Thank you for having me on your show.
So, Mark, I have a question for you. One of the things that we do to kind of tie our episodes together is we like to connect our previous episode with this episode by having our previous guest ask you a question. And their question was, what can we do as individuals to better combat negativity in our community today?
Wow. One of my favorite, it's an interesting question that you posed to me, Keenan, because one of my favorite quotes is from Colin Powell. And it goes like this: perpetual optimism is a force multiplier, right? If we all can exhibit a level of positivity and optimism and, quite frankly, kindness, and treat each other by, essentially the golden rule is really what I live by, then I think that spreads from individual to individual and it just becomes contagious. So I really feel that perpetual optimism, shared with one person is going to carry on to another. And I know that sounds simple, but it's not quite as simple and easy to do when you're faced with the everyday challenges of life.
What do you think about the framework of practical optimism? I've been messing around with this a little bit in my mind over the last couple months because part of my brand is I really put a lot of effort into being someone who's optimistic and positive. But I hear from some people often that there's something called toxic positivity. And it's interesting to me that we've gotten to a place in society where people are saying you're too positive about the situations that are going on. And so I've tried to reframe that into practical optimism, because what that means for me is I have the power to make decisions in the face of adversity and to choose being positive. What do you kind of think about that framework?
Keenan, I feel very strongly that we're all going to be faced with adversity, right? But adversity builds character. And I think at some times is that, you're going to fall down, you're going to have mistakes, you're going to go down a path oftentimes that perhaps you were not necessarily prepared for. But if you can keep a positive mindset during all of those times that you fall down, coming out at the other end is not only going to be have a positive response and have a significant change in you, but it's going to give you the tools and the toolkit to be able to overcome any of that negativity you might see in the future. And, one of the things we do within our organization is that, one of our unwritten rules, and I know I've said it before, is just a level of kindness. When you walk in the door in the morning, you say good morning to everybody. And it's something that I practice, and we have about 300 employees. And what happens is that becomes contagious. People model after the folks that they want to, they want to be, or they want to see, or who they strive to be. And so having that everyday level of just having not only a positive mindset, but being able to treat people with respect and treat people in the way that you want to be treated goes a long way towards just everyday interactions. Again, sounds simple in talk, not so simple in practice. But whether it's the barista at your local Starbucks or the guy that swerves in front of you, instead of giving him the middle finger, just give him a wave, say good morning. It changes your whole outlook on things, believe me.
How would you describe yourself as a human without anything that has to do with work? Who is Mark?
Who is Mark? Gosh, that's a challenging question. I think oftentimes many of us that are in leadership roles, you've heard of imposter syndrome, right? You get to a certain level and you always feel like, dude, did I deserve this, or should I be in this role? Me as a person, I try to be authentic in every interaction that I have with people. I consider myself a humanitarian, in that any interaction that I have with other people, whether there are folks within my organization, whether they are my neighbor, whether they are the guy that drives by me, on the street, is that I grew up in such a way, and take on those kind of characteristics from my grandparents, that it's just so important to be authentic and to be genuine. And if you can be authentic and genuine, your passion in whatever you do, whether that's work related, whether that is charity related, or whether that is relationship related, that is going to come out to other people, as far as knowing who you are specifically and what you stand for, which I think in today's world is a very challenging aspect of us as individuals. What do you truly stand for? Do you have core values that you stand for? Do you have a philosophy that you stand for? And that really identifies you as a person in this big world of diversity, right?
I mean, I feel like the biggest thing that you can do for yourself is to be proud of who you say you are. One of the things that I always talk about with my team and other people is confidence is not built by shouting affirmations in the mirror, but having a stack of undeniable proof behind you that you are who you say you are. And I feel like it's the consistent practitionership of being a good person in today's world that we need more than often. And when I sit across the table from somebody like you, I see how sharp, intellectual, and passionate you are for the space that you serve. But I have a question. Why did you kind of pick this path? Can we kind of share your journey from being a deputy sheriff, having a love for rhinos, and then finding your space in community service? Can you let the kind of audience know about kind of your journey so we can let them know?
Thanks, Keenan. My journey is really interesting in a lot of ways, and I'm an upstream thinker all the time. How can we improve the lives of the people around us, in any way possible? But I started my journey not really. When I went to college, I thought I was going to be in the medical profession, and that fell through. And quite honestly, when my undergrad was in criminal justice, I wanted to help people. Quite honestly, I wanted to help. I think I shared with you previously that I wanted to help animals at first, but also saw how much more meaningful it was to be a change agent in our community, for folks. And so I graduated from college in the late 1990s, with a criminal justice degree. Also had majors in biology and conservation. So I did think that I wanted to move to Africa and save the rhinos at one point. One of my thesis papers at the end of my college experience was, in fact, the how to save the rhinos, how to impact the white rhino and the black rhino and the Samaritan rhino and all these rhinos that were around the world. But I couldn't work in conservation, didn't have that opportunity. So I was hired as a deputy sheriff, a road patrol cop, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and did that work for a couple of years. Very meaningful, because I was always under the impression that, you need to help people. What I found is that I was very young. As a young cop, I was exposed to a lot of juveniles, a lot of adolescents who were getting into trouble. I mean, quite frankly, I would solve a lot of that crime. Why? Gap in age. I was a 21-year-old cop. These kids trusted me, and unfortunately, led to arrests. And a lot of these kids we would send down to Flint and to Detroit to lockup facilities, and they would come back to our community, frankly, worse than what we sent them down as. They would be gang affiliated. They would learn behaviors that were, much more violent than what we were used to, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so after 2 years of that work, I actually said, hey, this isn't working for me. Met some folks at an organization called Teaching Family Homes of Upper Michigan, affiliated with Boys Town, and I quit my job as a police officer and actually moved in to a home with the same boys that were being reintroduced to our community from those juvenile lockup facilities. And I got to tell you, it was a big change for me, but having the direct impact of a relationship with these kids, and believe me, it's all based on relationship. It's all based on trust. If you can establish the trust with these kids, you can change their lives for a lifetime. You really can. And so I did that work for a little bit, won some national awards. Don't like to talk a lot about myself, but that led to meeting some folks from Kids in Distress at a conference in San Antonio back in 1994. And they told me something that was very new at that time, is that the organization that I currently work for, Kids in Distress, was working with young victims of abuse and neglect. and really intervening at the earliest level possible to ensure that those kids never got introduced to the juvenile system, to the to systems that might harm them more than make them productive, have productive lives. And so I moved down here, moved into a group home with boys between the ages of 5 and 10 who had been through multiple failed foster placements, and did that work for a couple of years. When I arrived at Kids in Distress, we had about 40 employees. And what was really neat about the organization I work for now is that the two women who really founded this organization, their names hopefully will live in legacy, Jean Miley and Mitch Shaler. They were visionaries in that they knew that children could not grow up and could not learn skills adequately by just being essentially staying in a shelter, right, or staying in a foster home. They needed early childhood education. They needed clinical services to address their trauma. And so that led to really the organization evolving into a full child and family service organization with the predominant mission of preventing child abuse and going upstream in order to find out why were these kids really ending up in situations with their families that they were, and how can we prevent them from happening. The whole goal of our organization is really to shut ourselves down. How can we address issues at the earliest level possible so that we can impact the lives of kids before they get into situations that become more traumatizing to their self.
I mean, what an amazing mission is to put ourselves out of business. I talk to a lot of my other mental and behavioral health partners in large metropolitan areas, and I've had a few CEOs recite that to me. My biggest goal is to make sure that we are not necessary. And in itself is kind of a servant leadership model, right, in the community. I want to reverse a little bit and talk about some of those early days when you move into your group home and you're interacting with these individuals who maybe, like you said, have been arrested at one point in time. They're either the same individuals or remind you of people who you actually put into some of those detention centers. What were some of those early days like in the realization and kind of the human connection of needing to be supported? And how did you kind of pour into those individuals?
I'm not going to say that they are easy positions, right? There's a lot of stress. I know one of the things that we talked about early on was falling down. You make a lot of mistakes, early on when you intervene with those kids. But I have learned through many years, and also during that early time, is that, and it didn't take long to learn that, is that when you start to get to the children's level or get to the teenagers level, and all you have to do is develop that trust. Trust is so incredibly important. And as soon as you have that trust that you're there to help, you're there to support, you're there to mentor the kids. You're not there to tell them what to do. They're going to lead their own lives, but you're there to share with them your own experiences, as well as to just hold their hand. Many of these kids have never had a hug before. And again, those are those early kids. Those are 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who have never had the honor of having physical touch, even sometimes from their parents. And so, being able to gently let them know, hey, I'm a pat on the back. Let's go out and spend some personal time together, shooting baskets, running track and field, just spending quality time. It's a shame because many of the kids that you see that become juvenile delinquents, they haven't had that one-on-one time. They haven't had that quality time that has been shared with them that oftentimes will raise their own self-confidence, their own, how they look at themselves, how they see themselves as not only a positive member of society, but actually attaining and having goals that are reachable and attainable. And that comes later, after that relationship is developed fully. But if you don't start with meeting those kids where they're at, and sometimes meeting them where they're at is doing some uncomfortable things on your own. Those kids might be very, very, much more talented on the basketball court than I am. I might be pushed around, but I'm going to expose myself to some of those, those interactions because they might not have thought that I would. And as soon as they see that you're willing to go out there and put yourself out there to be uncomfortable, quite frankly, they're willing to be uncomfortable themselves.
Do you have a story from those early days where you felt like you were able to kind of tear some of those walls down of resistance between one of those kids and yourself?
Yeah, I do. And, of course, many kids are faced with runaway stories, right? Many kids, especially those kids that have been either introduced or exposed to trauma or have had, trauma-filled lives. is that we would keep kids that would run away. And oftentimes when they would run away, and I remember this 17-year-old, his name is David, grew up in a terrible, terrible household, ended up getting in trouble with drugs and things like that. This is going back all the way to 1994, one of the first, first kids in the home. And, he had a big, huge issue with running away. He would get home from school, and often, and what we found is that he was running away from his problems. He wasn't running away from us. He didn't want to he didn't want to tell us when he got an F, right, in school, because bad things happened when he would told people he got an F previously. So when he would run away, I would follow him, and he would go, get the F out of here. Don't want you. He would, he oftentimes he would become physically violent in a way, but I would assure him that I'm not leaving you, David. If you walk 5 miles down the road, I'm going to be there right with you. I'm going to be beside you every step that you take, because this is about safety. It's about your own safety, and it's about your own goals. And then I would bring it back. And oftentimes, I would let him know that if you want to run away, let's run away together. Let's take a 3-mile walk. And what that runaway turned into is it turned into a coping skill for him. It was no longer running away. It became eventually just taking a long walk, which is exactly what he needed. And quite frankly, it's something I do today. When I have a very stressful situation, I learned from David that, hey, if I take a 2-mile walk and I come back home, I'm in a much more different state of mind. And so we developed that relationship through long walks. And sometimes it would be long walks through the woods. It would be long walks down the highway. But I would be with him wherever he went. And it didn't take very long for him to figure out that not only is he going to get rid of, he's never going to get rid of me, but I'm going to be there for him, even if he does things that are, quite frankly, stupid. You know what I mean? Because I cared about him, I loved on him, and he was very important to me.
Mark, man, you're the true definition of heart and hustle, because there are so many things that you could truly contribute to and dedicate your mission to in life, but your willingness to show up for others when they don't want to show up for themselves is something that those individuals like David, to this day, I'm still sure remember. Are you in contact with David at all, or have you had any interactions with him since back in the day?
Not David specifically. It's interesting you asked that question because, I was, 23 years old, 24 years old, and those kids were all 17, 18. So I know where one of those boys are, so now they're, I'm 57. Those boys are all in their late 40s. I do know where every one of my boys are from our group home here in Wilton Manors. And I'm privileged and honored. They've had their own kids now, and I'm the godparent to some of those kids.
Oh, man, that's so cool. One of the subjects that I want to talk about today is isolationism. Isolationism is something that we talked about in a previous conversation. One of the things that I think is one of the biggest problems that we see in society, and back in 2022, the Surgeon General came on to a national broadcast and talked about the biggest problem that society is facing today is not another outbreak of the pandemic, but rather isolation and loneliness. Let's talk about that willingness in society today to isolate ourselves and some of the downstream effects of that. Because it seems like we live in a society today where we're running this lone wolf mentality. I don't need anybody. I can do my own thing. I have connection that comes from my little device, but I don't think that we really truly understand the impacts of isolation. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit.
I believe, quite frankly, Keenan, that, isolation is probably the pandemic of our lives in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic only intensified that and exponentiated that, because folks not only had to be isolated, but they got used to being isolated and didn't realize how significant that impacts their lives. The most important thing you can do for your health is not, I'm a huge weightlifter, right? I love lifting weights in the gym, but that's not the best, and diet is real important. But the most significant thing you can do for your life is human connection. It's having friends, having connections, having confidants. And in many, many studies, as you noted, the human connection is the catalyst towards having a healthy body, a healthy mind, a healthy soul, and in many ways. And I think, unfortunately, because of the society that we live in, people have almost gone the opposite way. They feel like the less that I have to deal with society or societal norms, and I think a lot of it is because of division, quite frankly. It would never get into politics on your show, right? But there's so much division, and there's so much, non-authentication of people that they don't truly want. They share a false self, and you see that in social media, and you see that on gaming sites. And gaming sites are not, that's not So, that's not connections. It's a type of connection, but it's not the connection you need where human touch and direct conversation. We get so many folks that come to our organization now who have been trained and educated to be social workers, but yet they lack the skills to truly involve themselves in human connection. And we almost have to reteach them how important it is to develop trust, to make sure that you're thinking outside of yourself, and to hold a conversation where you're actually not just thinking about what you're going to say next, but you're truly listening to what other people have to say, because that alone can impact how somebody feels about you and the trust they have for you. And I think, unfortunately, that's been lost in so many ways, not only in society, but in education, in corporate responsibility, and in many other areas.
It's really interesting to me that we are in a time where the solution for a lot of our problems is coming together as people. One of the things that we were talking about in isolation is the downstream effects of a shorter, less fulfilling life. Have you ever heard of blue zones before?
I have not.
Okay, so there's a thing called blue zones. There are 5 of them in the world. They're located in the Middle East, Japan. I want to say there's a couple other locations throughout the world, right? And the blue zones are where the biggest population of centurions live, people who live to be 100 years old. And they talk about the societal factors in those zones. The most common is a social network. They use an incredible example of, in Japan, there are people who are 95, 96, 97, 100 plus years old, and they all have a tight-knit community. Because what they found is when you have social connection, you have the ability to offload your stress onto a group. They can support you, but also they have the ability to uplift you and give you something to look forward to on a daily basis. And I just get so worried about our society today because everybody is constantly spending time on their device. It's very similar to what we're talking about in that gaming element. We're sharing a curated version of ourselves, a curated sense of connection, but it seems like we're almost afraid to kind of take our guard down to let people see the true vulnerable version of ourselves. Does that make sense?
Complete and 100%. In the blue, I've never used or heard the term blue zone, but I have actually read, the statistics. And in many of those cultures, there's also a connection between generations, right?
Yes.
Where you have a connection between grandparents and great grandparents, that there's, and I think, and I don't want to put it in a gross way, but it gives the elderly folks really the motivation to live, because they know that they're still having impact. And I do think sometimes, especially in our Western society in America, is that we almost don't respect or hold a reverence for the elderly folks who are grandparents, who can share stories about their own challenges and how they conquered them and how they persevered. There's almost a lack of respect there with some of our newer generations. And it's just so incredible. One of the things that we've done in our organization is that in our preschool, we actually have grandparents from our local, assisted living facility that come into the school, and they're volunteers, and they feel like, they don't feel, they are, giving to the organization, and they're giving up their time, and they're just wonderful group of people, but they seldom realize the impact that this is having on them personally, and on our children. I mean, don't get me wrong. Our kids benefit greatly from having these folks here. I think we have about 18 of them that are in our preschool. And but what it does when they go back is that we always get the feedback from the folks back at the assisted living facilities that there was almost a change in demeanor. There was almost, getting back to that optimism. They have the willingness, they have the desire to want to see tomorrow, because they're going back to the preschool. You know what I mean? And so the impact it has on both our kids and on that aging generation is incredibly significant. And I think that should be done in more, not just in preschools. It should be done in the educational system. There's so much that we all can learn from not only the greatest generation, but all the generations that follow. Because, I know one of the things we talked about earlier was, as life gets easier and people have to go through less challenges, I'm not so sure that's a good thing. Because if you don't have that sense of knowing that you are resilient, that you've been knocked down and you have the ability to get up, If you're knocked down and you're 55 years old, I'm not sure how fast you're going to get up because you haven't been through all those other challenges that many of the folks that are older than you, in fact, have.
There was a study that we were talking about in our previous conversation, and it talked about Gen Z being one of the least Generation Z has the least perceived of resiliency and efficacy on their world, meaning they think somebody's going to come save them. Efficacy, I can't change things. Somebody's going to have to come save us. But the other is resiliency. And often the connection is made in the study that we were talking about previously when you have a isolated family group and you don't have exposure to your parents, you don't have exposure to your grandparents or even your great grandparents. There's no ability for oral stories to be passed down. One of the things that I really had a tough time with a couple of years ago, my grandfather passed away. He was about 76 years old at the time, so young on the scale of life. And one of the things that I wish I would have been able to do is spend more time with him to hear the stories of what he overcame. Because those simple innuendos and tales of resiliency, I had to overcome these challenges, are things that we can draw back on for inspiration in times of tough times. And I think that if you're looking for stories of resiliency and determination on things like social media and from your peer groups, you're often not going to get them. And so it seems very easy to understand when we come across hard times why it's so easy to fold the cards, because we don't have any examples of somebody who's actually overcome these challenges in the past.
And Keenan, I think, bringing another topic into the conversation is that suicide rates are at an all-time high, right, across our country and higher among specific population groups. And it's not something that we work with in our nonprofit specifically, but we are exposed to in many ways. And I have a strong belief that a partial issue as to why that is on the rise is because people don't have the skill set to deal with the adversity that we're talking about because they've never been knocked down. They've never led a hard life. And a hard life oftentimes is the most meaningful life. And when you are able to persevere, and have the resilience to be able to transcend when you get knocked down, you're able to change, you're able to evolve, you're able to deal with small and inevitable knockdowns in the future. And unfortunately, like I said, when you get to be my age and you have a significant knockdown that happens and you haven't had all those smaller ones, in the past, and we all of us deal with the fact that, middle-aged and, having breakdowns when you become a certain age, it's a real thing. I think we all kind of wonder what our next is and, are we going to be fruitful and are we going to be able to succeed? But I remember my grandparent, for example, my Grandpa Wolf, very tough life, very tough life. Lost his wife at a very, very young age when, before I was born. Lived in isolation for many, but had, very strong friendships. But went through many, many jobs and many employment. And that gave him the opportunity to be resilient. And when you become resilient, you become unstoppable. There really is nothing you can't do if you know that, hey, I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to fall down, but I was able to get up before and I'm going to do it again. And that's when you become unstoppable. And that's when meaningful change and really being able to succeed is, in my view, inevitable.
I mean, let's use this as an opportunity to kind of throw a couple analogies in here. If you, like we talked about a little earlier, we both like going to the gym. When you first go to the gym, it's very difficult to put up heavy weight, but the more and more that you put your body through resistance in tough times, the more weight you're able to push. I heard an analogy the other day on a podcast, and it was talking about resistance in life. And the analogy was given, imagine if your parents never wanted you to actually walk as a child because they were worried about the friction and the resistance that your bones were going to have when you were stepping across the ground. Imagine if they never let you play outside. Imagine if you extrapolate that across your entire life, and the first time you come across any type of situation where you hop out of a chair, your bones would literally break. So resistance and overcoming tough times and experiences is part of life, but it's not only just part of it, it's necessary to be able to overcome bigger challenges in the future.
Yep.
And I feel like that's so important to be able to kind of recognize. What do you think about
Can I
these
give you an
eighth place
analogy
trophies?
real quick before you answer another question?
Of course.
Because This is a story that I actually share, and it's interesting that you brought up the whole workout analogy, because one of the examples that I use from a leadership perspective with our team is progressive overload, right? That you're never going to grow unless you overload the bar and are able to, and that, physically, you can't grow your muscles, okay? And as we're talking about isolationism, I love to go to the gym. I love to put my headphones in and listen to inappropriate music and have no one bother me because I deal with people all day long, right? But I want to say about a year ago, young gun comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, mister, what are your goals in the gym?" And I told him, "Buddy, I'm 57 years old. If I can push up this 225 10 times when I'm 60, my goals are satisfied, right?" But then I got to thinking, I very much isolate myself at the gym, right? I'm not going to grow anymore unless I get progressive overload. So I enlisted this kid to spot for me, right? And what I found is that I was starting to push up 225 15, 16 times. I would not have been able to do that with myself. I needed a spotter. And every day in life, and it goes back to our conversation about isolationism, if you don't have a spotter in your life, you're not going to grow because you're not going to be able to get the help when you need it and to rely on somebody and to push on someone, but you're also not going to be able to get the guidance. What if I'm pushing this weight up in the wrong way? I'm going to injure myself. He's the only one that's going to be able to tell me I'm doing it wrong. I'm not going to be able to identify that on myself. So that whole analogy about, progressive overload and building and growing, you've got to have somebody else to help you to do that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen in the gym and in life itself.
You're 1,000% right. Because how much more willing are you to fail under the bar when you have a spotter?
Right.
Because I'll tell you, I will push myself to that 11th, that 12th rep, but I won't go for 13 and 14 because I'm like, I'm not going to drop this on my throat. You know what I mean? But when I've got a friend who's next to me, I'm willing to push it because I know I've got that support. And that's a perfect little small analogy that is just so powerful. I would like to ask you a little bit about 8th place trophies. Over the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about 8th place trophies and how they'll be the demise of these future generations. What's your kind of 2 cents on the negative impacts of 8th place trophies and why do you think they really came from?
Well, Keenan, I'm not a strong believer in trophies at all. Except for the folks that excel. That's kind of how I grew up, and I would have to probably let you know that I have been an athlete all my life. Even my wife says, "Mark, you're an athlete. I'm not an athlete. You succeeded in many ways, but I also feel that again, disappointments happen in life. And if you get a trophy for everything that you do, just for participating, I'm not so sure that you're rewarding folks in the way that they should be rewarded. And I know that's controversial, very controversial, especially when you're dealing with young children. But I would also say that I have a baby grandchild, name is Josephine. She's going to be 1 next week, right? And Josephine, of course, started to crawl, and very early on, and then she walked and she fell down a lot. And then she ended up going back to crawling. I'm not going to walk because I can't do it. And her parents were so smart at that point that they said, "No, we're going to help her walk and we're going to hold her hand and we're going to show her what to do." And they didn't use a reward system. What they used was the fact that, she's going to fail, but she's going to get up. We're not going to reward her with a cookie every single time she walks because the reward system then becomes, if you reward too much, what happens is that people then expect a reward. There's an expectation of that. This is it's going to come to me without doing the hard work. And I got to tell you, success doesn't come easy. It doesn't come easy in business. It doesn't come easy personally. It doesn't come easy for sure in athletics, is that you have to fail and you have to work at it. And if you get a trophy just because you crossed the finish line, I'm not so sure you're rewarding the type of behavior that kids nowadays need to be rewarded for. And again, no, that's controversial, but I'm pretty strong, a strong believer in that.
Yeah, I'm 100% behind that as well. I always like to point the finger back at, there's a lot of judgment, the finger that gets cast at your generation got 8th place trophies. But I always like to ask the question, who was at the trophy store buying the 8th place trophies? Because it wasn't the 5-year-old
right.
who was standing on the t-ball field, right? We need to kind of look at the sense of accountability. How do you kind of leverage a sense of accountability in your own personal life as a leader and kind of the things that you do as Mark on a daily basis for your family and everybody else?
Well, I think discipline is very lost. Also in today's society, we talk about isolationism. Discipline is incredibly important to me. I am probably more routine oriented, unfortunately, than most. But that routine also tells me that, motivation is often utilized as a tool for people. I'm motivated to, I use the gym analogy again. I'm motivated to go to the gym. Well, no, you're not. You're not motivated to go to the gym every day. There's many days, and people look at me and they'll say, I'm in decent shape. Well, you must be really motivated to go to the gym. You have a lot of passion. The number of days I drive home and I want to say, the heck with this. I don't want to do it today, it's probably more often than not at my age. But the reality is that the discipline is what carries you through. The discipline of knowing that, that hard work is going to result in me not only looking the same, but feeling the same. And then you translate that to work is that I have a lot of discipline around being at work at a certain time. I want to be in my chair at 8 o'clock in the morning. Why? Because I want to be ready for work. Work probably doesn't start until 9:30. But knowing that I'm here at a certain time and having that discipline to be in a routine that is going to set me up for success is very, very, very important.
I have a book on my shelf back over here. It's called Atomic Habits by James Clear. Have you ever heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
It's a beautiful book because it talks about the compounding effect of small, tiny actions on a daily basis and how they can compound into the future. I very much like you have a huge fitness habit that I've developed because back in the day, I used to be motivated when I was 90 pounds overweight to go to the gym to lose weight. But then I started building the habit that turned into me showing up as my current version of myself because of the habit that I've built in going to the gym. Am I motivated to go there? Absolutely not.
Right.
Do I want to put on my shoes and run my 1.5 miles, 2 miles every single day? Absolutely not. But I realize that when I do those things, I'm doing right by myself, which gives me the ability to show up as my best self for not only the individuals around me, but also the team and the interactions that I have with you. And so it's like a sense of confidence in staying disciplined that nobody can take away from you, which I feel like is so beautiful. But so many people today often say that routine and habits make my life boring. From my perspective, I think about it in the opposite way. Those routines and habits keep my life consistent so I don't have to think about going to the gym or muster up all of that mental fortitude and power to get out of the chair and drive to the gym and do all of that type of stuff, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. As soon as last night, I actually had a pretty important mixer. I was in Miami at our new office down there, and I got a call, and the call was, we don't have enough people at this mixer. We really want you to come. We really want you to go. And all I could think in my head is that, oh my gosh, I'm going to miss the gym if I do that. And I got the exact quote that you got. Well, why do you always have to go? Can't you just skip the gym once? Can't you just skip that? And what that leads to is it leads to what we were talking about before, is that then your habit doesn't become consistent. And whether, again, it's work related, it's workout related, it's corporate related, it's those tiny incremental changes and those tiny incremental activities that add up to this big goal, that you'll appreciate yourself, you'll respect yourself. And a lot of that is about respect. It's about having the respect for yourself to know that this is the type of person I want to be and I want to continue to be. All of the conversations and all of the values that we've talked about are kind of all woven in together, with these concepts.
I want to talk a little bit about overcoming challenges from the perspective of being a nonprofit. So one of the things that we recognize is that when you're serving the community, the reward of it is kind of intangible because the instantaneous impact that you're seeing is not nationally televised. Right. And there's a lot of challenges that you face as a nonprofit when it comes to reimbursement, services, and everything else like that. So let's kind of talk about, from your perspective as the leader of your organization, some of the challenges that come along with being in the nonprofit space.
Well, Keenan, I think that, there's a couple big challenges that have emerged more recently. I think traditionally with a nonprofit is that nonprofits, and I've heard this analogy before, is that, said to people, whether at corporate level or funder levels, is that you have nonprofits at the trough, right? Kind of eating the leftovers all the time. And that is true with some of us that are in the space and true with specific funding. But the reality is that those folks who get into nonprofit that think that government or funders are going to always take care of the problem or take care of the resources that we might have, it's a false statement. Again, you have to kind of pick up your big girl, panties, and you have to say, I'm going to create my own inevitability, my own goals in the organization. Because, when we used to have a shelter here at our organization, at Kids in Distress, we would always say that the Department of Children and Families, the state of Florida, what they pay for is 3 hots and a cot, right? 3 meals and a place to sleep. They don't pay for all the extra that our children need to truly thrive in this environment. Will they survive? Absolutely. Will they thrive? Absolutely not. Children need increasing ratios, more staff to be able to hold their hand and encourage them. We need to make sure that our kids have birthday parties And so what you often have as a nonprofit is you have to create a whole lot of different funding streams from the philanthropic side of the organization in order to keep your organization afloat. Our organization has, I'm pretty transparent, about a $38 million budget. We raised over $4 million to elevate our programs from adequacy, that is government funded, to excellence that we believe in. And we'll do that every single day, or we're not going to provide the program, because we have a standard that we not only comply with, but we expect. Secondarily, besides funding, is that, and it's not only the case with nonprofits, is that sourcing new talent is such a significant issue across multi industries. But for nonprofits, it's crippling in a lot of ways, because even myself, is that I got into this business knowing that I'm never going to be rich. You know what I mean? It's not going to happen. I'm not going to be the $1 million a year, $20 million a year CEO that they have you have in corporate, but the work is meaningful. Okay. Unfortunately, with some of the new talent that we're attracting, that those dollars are significant, and you can't pay them the level. Most folks could go to Amazon, work in the Amazon warehouse for what we're offering them as a clinician. And that is a very significant challenge right now, very significant in our in the nonprofit space, because talent is really hard to come for, and then we're competing, with a whole lot of other nonprofits for that talent, and it's really challenging. It's a challenging place to be, especially when you've been in this business for over 30 years, like I have.
It's really hard because when I think about the societal forces that are against you, we've got people who are of a younger age demographic who want something of an instantaneous reward for the work that they do. And it doesn't seem like at your guys' organization, that's something that you see instantaneously. We talk about the financial pressure of today. When you've got students coming out of school with debt, they need to be able to pay their bills. They need to be able to pay their loans off. And if we can't compensate them, then we're not going to be able to give them a place where they can feel psychologically safe to do the work that they need. And then when we have competition in the private sector that says, come work over here for XYZ dollars, don't worry about the community. But then when we have the government funding that isn't fulfilling the needs for excellent service,
right,
it's just outrageous to me that you talk about raising $4 million a year to get back to a state of excellence.
Right.
But in our previous conversation, I had mentioned, if you have somebody who's at a deficit, you need to be able to give 120, 150, 200% to get them back to a point of adequacy.
Yes.
And it just seems like you guys are fighting against some of the societal currents that might be pushing us in a different direction. And I just appreciate the work that you do seriously every single day, because without the community-based organizations like yours, there are so many more children on a daily basis who are going to fall in between the cracks that we're not going to be able to support. And you guys just provide such an amazing safety net for your community.
Thank you, Keenan. Thank you. What we've established in our organization to transcend the issues of pay and things like that is culture. I'm a very, very strong believer in two things: core values, culture. If you can spread that, those core values, here's what we stand for, and we're not going to compromise ourselves on our core values of compassion and safety and wisdom and tenacity, that has to do with work ethic. We're going to do whatever it takes to help people, and sometimes that means we're working a lot of hours, and sometimes that means we're going to get out of our comfort zone. But if we develop a culture that is willing to do that, because they're passionate, just like I was passionate about the rhinos, I still am, quite honestly. Someday I'm going to go to Africa, right? And I hopefully I can do something. But the reality is, my passion now is children. I want children to be safe. I want children to be able to thrive. I want children to be able to change their lives for a lifetime, to be able to really achieve their dreams. And that's my passion. And if we can instill that in folks, no matter what, there's only limited resources. Resources are finite, in everything that we do. And unfortunately, in South Florida, it has kind of gotten to this toppling point because of the cost of living. Housing prices down here, outrageous. And so the level that we can actually pay people is now very compromised by the level that they can actually afford to live here. And so we're losing a significant generation. Those folks that would stay in their community. My son is one of them. He was in the Army for 10 years. He actually is going to be a history teacher now. He was actually a military police officer, so kind of followed in my footsteps a little bit. Now he's going to be a teacher, and he would have loved to come back to South Florida, but he can't afford to live in South Florida. They have a beautiful home in South Carolina. That's where he's going to stay. But I use that example because the emerging talent of the next generation is leaving our community because of the cost is so high and salaries have not kept up. And in the nonprofit sector, we're behind the curve in many ways because we just don't have the resources to really address that issue significantly.
And it seems like that's almost a factor that contributes to the earlier part of our conversation in that isolation factor, right? Yeah. When you're disconnected from family, you're disconnected from your social groups, you have to go move to a new state. It's very difficult to be unified and confident in how we're going to be able to navigate the future because we don't have that support group. I hear so many people who are in my generation, millennials who graduate from school, they've got $150,000, $200,000 plus dollars in debt, and they have to take a job that gives them the ability just to be able to pay off their loans. They can't think about the future. They're not psychologically safe to say, I'm going to hold this job down and contribute to a community-based organization because I can do these things, buy a home, and live the American dream. Have you heard of a topic called DINKS? It's dual income, no kids households.
I have, yep.
That has become so popular today, and people think that millennials and other generations are being selfish in that manner. But exactly like what you talked about, there are some societal factors that push against even the American dream of being able to own a home because housing is so incredibly expensive everywhere you go that unless you're making a lot of money, you can't afford to invest into those type of things, which is really scary.
Incredibly scary. And I think that realizing the American dream, and that dream is changing. It's evolving. It's changing. The number, related to that, the number of households or the number of couples that are having children later in life as well. And again, I think there will be studies done and there will be, some generational issues that will address that. But gosh, we have several employees that are in their 40s having their first child. And I'm happy for them, congratulate them. They're having a child. It's a wonderful thing. But how does that change our societal norms? And, there's going to be positive consequences of that and there's going to be negative consequences of that. And many times they're waiting for them to be older to have kids, not because they want to do that, but because they're forced to do it based on current economics and current conditions of the society. And that just will change the way our society works. And it will also influence something that we've talked about earlier, which is the ability to share those generational stories with the next generation. Because, just from as you age, if you're having a baby at 45, your grandparents and great-grandparents are going to have less access to those children. So less access to those stories of resilience and coping and things like that. So that will change, who we are as a society pretty significantly.
I mean, there are so many elements. One of the big topics of discussion today is the cost of childcare. On average, I think it costs about $36,000 a year for childcare now. And one of the things that I was blessed enough to do was live in Hawaii for a couple of years. And something I experienced about the culture there was something called Ohana homes. So because the cost of living is so expensive there, the communities and society had to revert back to grandparents live upstairs, family lives downstairs. When family starts having children, guess who takes care of those children? The people who live upstairs, and those are grandparents.
Yep.
And so it almost creates out of necessity that home and that family culture that is so necessary, and you can avoid some of those high costs. But once again, there's so many factors of the small things of not living in the same community as your family, having to pay for somebody else to take care of your kids. Now they're raising them and introducing their culture to them as well. It's just very interesting. And I think we're going to have to combat this in so many different ways.
I love that model, by the way. Absolutely love that model. And it's very related to what we run a preschool, so having that next generation in the preschool is incredibly important. One of and kind of on a personal story related to that is that our kids brought our son, his wife bought their forever home. It was the second home they purchased about 5 months ago. And one of the things they offered is, can you help us a little bit? And we helped them, but we actually have a room in their home that we're able to travel and spend more time with it. So we were a little bit creative in how we developed that, but there was meaning again. It wasn't just so that we were helping them with the home and we have to have a space. We wanted access. We wanted access to the grandchildren. We wanted to be able to share our stories with with our grandkids when they grow up. And so that is very much what you're talking about, is that I feel like the isolationism with some families is not not promoting, that physical contact and that communication that again is so incredibly important in sharing, sharing resilience. Again, it all comes back to sharing their stories of resilience and modeling as much as just as important, modeling the resilience. Because when our kids see us fall down and get back up, that just gives them the encouragement, the motivation and the realism that, hey, that could happen to me and I could persevere as well.
What's the biggest impact that you're hoping to have on your grandchildren? What is like kind of the lessons you're trying to instill or a message that you want to kind of impact on them as they're kind of growing up?
My core values are very, very simple, Keenan, in a lot of ways. I have a level, I expect kindness. It's not one of our core values. When I do our orientation here at KIT, I concentrate on our core values that I mentioned before. And then I have two others, kindness and collaboration, right? I'm a big proponent that kindness can really change the world in a lot of ways. And when I'm talking about my granddaughter, I want her to know that there's always going to be someone there for her, but the level of kindness that you show to other humans is really going to be how you're viewed as a human. It really is. You're even when you're having a bad day, being able to just say hello. And I grew up in a very rural, outback kind of place where you wave to everybody that's walking down the street, and I get some pretty weird looks when I do that down here, in South Florida. But the reality is that that's how you relate to people. And if you can establish a relationship that is rooted in the fact that you care about them, and come on, that's what kindness is about. It's really communicating to others that you care about who they are as a person, and you're willing to listen to them, and you're willing to spend time with them. And one of my favorite things to do with my granddaughter is go up there and just sit in her playroom and have her play around me and, and grab things for her and do that. And that, again, it's relationship development, but there's a level of just helping her and modeling for her that if I can instill a level of kindness, if you have compassion for your fellow, and compassion goes a long way, not only your fellow humans, but the animals around you, the environment around you, then people are going to look at you as a world changer just because of the little things that you do. You don't have to be a CEO, to do that. You don't have to be the Jeff Bezos, to really impact the people around you. All you really have to do is be kind.
And like you said earlier in our conversation, when you are kind to others around you, that is a multiplicative effect that kind of echoes and ripples out from around you. Mark, it's been such a pleasure in being able to host you on the show. Seriously, learning about your story, your passion, the core values that you instill in yourself, but also in your organization and team, and what you're doing for your community is truly the definition of a leader who exemplifies and lives what truly Heart and Hustle really is. As we kind of land the plane here, Mark, I would love to give you the opportunity to ask a question of our next guest. What would you like to ask?
Sure. One of the things we haven't delved a lot into, Keenan, is leadership, right? Although a lot of what we talked about is leadership, at least how you instill leadership in others. But I'm always interested in people classifying and know or asking somebody, what is their defining leadership behavior? What do you see is the most defining behavior that you can exhibit, to your followers and to your fellow leaders that will really define who you are as a leader? That's always it's a question that I pose to many of our team members when I interview them, when I meet them for the first time, because everybody has their own definition of leadership and everybody has what they feel is the most important aspect of leadership. And it's always interesting to me how diversified those responses are.
Well, I love that, man. I want to give you the last couple seconds here to highlight where people can learn and find more information about you personally, if that's LinkedIn, if it's a website, wherever that is, but also tell us a little bit more about how we can find out more about Kids in Distress and Family Central. That would be super helpful.
Awesome, Keenan. Thank you. I'm on social media. My last name is an odd name, Mark Dhooge, Dhooge. So all my social media handles are Mark Dhooge. Easy to find. And Kids in Distress, of course, we have a website, www.kidinc.org, KIDINC.org. We impact, like I said, about 20,000 children annually throughout South Florida through our continuum of programs. We have many specialized events that we hold down here. Our most greatest is our Duck Fest Derby. We throw 40,000 rubber duckies in the New River down here in Fort Lauderdale every single year. And people from around the nation. So, want to help a child, buy a $5 duck from us, down in South Florida. And now those $5 go a long way. But, we have an incredible team here at KID. And I got to tell you, I'm just so honored to be on your show and to, spread a little bit about how I feel about the world and the impact that our agency has.
Well, you're doing an amazing job, man. Once again, for everybody who's watching and listening today, Mark, thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Really appreciate you being on the show. That's a wrap.
You're welcome.